TV1 රැස්වීදෙන ජීවිතේ.
Newsfirst, Newsline with Faraz Shaukutali.
And a splendid evening to you. This is Newsline Live. I'm broadcasting today from the studios here in Dawson Street, the Newsfirst studios, returning to our normal habitat. However, the people of Sri Lanka seem a long way off from returning to their peaceful, normal habitat. And the situation in the country, the people's social distress is continuing to grow despite some sort of effort on the part of the government of the day. However, none of this has inspired the people out there protesting to actually pack up and go home. And more, the perception that there is a growing human rights violations continues to worry the sovereign people of Sri Lanka. And we thought we'll make that our discussion today, especially in light of what happened back in the town that I come from, in Rambukana. The Rambukana incident has caused a lot of concern right across society in our country, and not only in our country. The antennas, the watchdogs internationally have also picked up on the story, which isn't actually any good for Sri Lanka, especially in its terms when it's trying to renegotiate its loans and asking basically with the begging bowl from the IMF and wherever. So to discuss this growing human rights violations and the apparent inability of this government to resolve that issue 2 years later appears to be a good debate to have as any. And my guest this evening is Dr. Gehan Gunatilleke, who is a constitutional and human rights attorney. He's an expert, really. So, good evening.
Good evening, good evening.
And tell me, what's the bit about, what are you doing with Oxford? What's that?
I'm doing a postdoctoral research fellowship.
Good.
There's no teaching, just writing a book.
But you'll continue to live in Sri Lanka?
I'm here for most of the year, actually, yeah.
And so you're committed to work in this country?
That's right.
And to live in this country?
Absolutely, yeah.
But with your talent and, you know, with your specialist skills, I'm sure that you can get a permanent residency most any part of the world.
Not on the agenda.
Not on the agenda?
No.
Aren't you tired, sick and tired of what's going on in this country? 74 years later, I have to actually not have power, like so many of our fellow citizens.
I mean, what you're saying is absolutely right, but personally, I don't see a reason to jump ship. We ultimately are
But at what point, Dr. Gunatilleke, at what point does your frustration break and say, you know, sod this for a game of soldiers, I'm going, I'm leaving, because I can't handle it. At where is that limit? Is it you pretty way off that
I don't
limit?
know. I hope we never come to that limit. I'm sure there's a personal limit for everyone, but right now I can say personally that I'm not at that limit. I can see why people would argue that, because everyone is on the street because they're personally affected by this crisis.
Well, yes. I mean, the fundamental right is the right to life.
Absolutely, yeah.
Along with that, it's not even a close second, it's almost sort of enjoined at the waist, if you like, is the right to food.
Yep.
And again, another one is, of course, the right to choose the type of food you want to eat. If you want organic, well, you know, that's your right. But with the whole world, and this is the statistics from the World Bank, the entire global production or consumption of organic food is less than 2%. And so that means to the flip side is that 98% of the world takes non-organic food, which we've all been used to. So, in my view, ladies and gentlemen, in my analysis, I believe that President Gotabaya Rajapaksa got it wrong. He let us down on the fundamental right to have food, the fundamental right to choose what type of food we have, whether it's organic or chemical, whatever. And he's failed on both those issues, but he's also failed on addressing the people's social distress. And amongst that, there is this matter of human rights abuses or violations, which successive governments don't seem to be getting anywhere towards addressing it. What's the problem, Dr. Gehan Gunatilleke? Why is Sri Lanka so flippant, if you like, our legislators? Why are they so flippant on a matter that they know means a lot to our international trading partners?
I mean, you're talking about human rights in general, right?
Yeah.
I think there is this incredible bravado and callousness, arrogance when it comes to dealing with our international partners, right? And we saw that, and I remember being on the show maybe a year back where we talked about the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and just the attitude of the government in dealing with members of the international community, and dismissing some of the concerns. And these concerns are often emanating from sources within Sri Lanka. It's not the international community that's, creating and manufacturing these concerns. Victim groups are raising these issues, and they're getting reflected in international fora. And the way in which we dealt with that, to just dismiss it and say we can do all of this by ourselves, we don't need anyone interfering, is sort of the same attitude that we see in terms of how we are dealing with the international economic crisis as well. For a very long time, we dismissed any kind of advice, any kind of concern, and said we can do it our way. So there seems to be a pattern here. And as much as our problems with human rights have been long-standing, I think there is a connection between the way in which we handled human rights violations and concerns and the way in which economic concerns are being handled today. This callousness and disregard for human interests is all pervasive.
Now, Dr. Gehan Gunatilleke, yesterday, these protests are not limited to what's happening at Gulf Face, by no stretch of anyone's imagination. And if any network is only showing you Gulf Face and trying to portray this as some sort of flippant exercise of frivolity, well, you're pretty mistaken, and you're living in some other planet. The people of Sri Lanka are distressed, and they have got the one thing they can do is to go on the streets and protest and get noticed. Because unfortunately, having given these cast your vote, and they've got a legal mandate, what they don't seem to realize, and this is what I gather from my conversations when I've been out on the streets of Colombo, trying to get my head around what's going on, the message they're giving is that they have lost the moral right. They may have the legal right, but they've lost the moral. They've certainly lost the moral high ground. They don't even go anywhere close to that. But Dr. Gehan, what I want to ask you is yesterday's incident in the place where I come from, Ramukana. So those people who in Ramukana are pretty hardworking, and they get on with life despite the challenges. But they've obviously gone beyond this sort of tolerance level. But I want to ask you, this, without any investigation, some people are claiming that the police only used minimal force. Can you define minimal force?
Okay, so let's look at what happened yesterday. And before I analyze what happened, and this is all based on what is just reported. So we need an independent, impartial investigation into the incident for us to really know what happened. But let me begin by saying that peaceful assemblies, peaceful protests are not unlawful in this country. There is a fundamental right to protest in a peaceful assembly. That's a constitutionally guaranteed right.
Yeah.
Article 14 is very clear that everyone has the right to peaceful assembly.
Yeah.
So you can't equate a peaceful assembly as an unlawful assembly. That's the first thing to remember.
Yeah.
Something becomes an unlawful assembly when violence is committed by 5 or more people.
Right.
So that element of violence needs to be there for the state and for the police to consider an assembly an unlawful assembly. Right. So that's the first thing. Now there's a way in which unlawful assemblies can be dispersed, and our criminal law sets out the parameters within which the police can act. So this is only with respect to unlawful assemblies.
Right.
So presuming that this was an unlawful assembly, the police have to act in a particular way. And there you have very specific provisions in the Criminal Procedure Code, Section 95, which is clear about what the police can do and what it can't do. And it's clear that the police, when they seek to disperse an unlawful assembly, needs to act within reasonableness. That means it can only take what is reasonably necessary to disperse a crowd. And we assume that that does not involve the use of lethal force. Lethal force can never be reasonably necessary to disperse a crowd. Now, say for example the police is unable to disperse a crowd. It's beyond the control of the police. There's a provision that the police can then rely on where it invites members of the armed forces to step in to once again use military force to disperse the crowd. The law is also very clear about what the military personnel can do. And it's very clear that you cannot cause injury and loss to life or property unless it is absolutely necessary. Because the law says that when military personnel get involved, they have to make sure that the least amount of injury and the least amount of force is used when dispersing the crowd. So we are not even there because we didn't deploy the military in that particular context. We had the police use lethal force, and did it do so as a last resort? I'm not sure it did. Did it use water cannons? Did it use rubber bullets? Did it use other means of dispersing the crowd, tear gas? We don't know that. The use of live ammunition in a situation like that, it seems to me, is a disproportionate, excessive use of force that the law doesn't provide for. So really, what we saw yesterday is morally reprehensible, because to take a life, it has to be in the most extraordinary circumstances. We often morally permit it only in the context of self-defense, to take another life, right? So morally reprehensible to take a life over, a protest. It is legally, I think, impermissible, and we have to wait a full investigation to know that for sure. But from the reports, it's quite clear that the use of lethal force by the police is not permitted under our law. It has to be the absolute last resort, and it only is in the context of a situation becoming more like a war zone and the military being invited to intervene. So that we didn't see. And it is also politically bizarre in a situation where the country has so many towns and villages and cities with protests to actually take live ammunition into that situation, and instead of using other means, firing at protesters, killing them.
That suggests to me, Dr. Gehan Gunatilleke, that the actions of the police have been devoid of considering the use of rubber bullets, for example, because they went there with live ammunition.
It's bizarre politically because this only adds fuel to the people's outrage. The fact that one of the protesters has been killed, the fact that he's a father, is a young man, that only adds to the outrage that the public are now displaying. So I cannot even understand it politically, and why on earth they would have gone to this sort of extent in a context where there's so much outrage. So it's morally, legally, politically all incomprehensible to me.
Now, some people, yesterday when we got the information that there was this killing of this protester, some people were sort of pointing out that this is also happened previously under President Mahinda Rajapaksa, and when we had that trouble at Ratapaswala.
That's right, yeah.
Now, Ratapaswala, must point out that there was actually two incidents.
Yeah.
One was to do with a private company, but there was another protest in which the people of the area were asking for drinking water.
That's right.
And that got out of hand. And again, you know, the army were called in and there was shooting and so on and so forth. And again, the sovereign people, members of our citizenry, are the ones who got the short end of the stick there.
Yeah.
So there's, like you said at the beginning, there seems to be a pattern of this, because it seems to be almost inherent in the DNA of this ruling government.
Yes, and I think it's also important to maybe make a distinction here. In certain areas, the police have been acting with enormous restraint, right? And they have been proportionate in their response to protesters. In other areas, like in Rambukana, the police have failed to do that. So it is also localized in many ways. It sometimes depends on the leadership in that area to make choices when they're confronted with difficult situations, with dilemmas, what to actually do. And the experienced officers that are able to actually assess something and analyze something and take the right path will take the right path. So it's probably unfair to cast the, aspersions on the entire institution.
Quite.
Right? But I think at the localized level, you do have trigger-happy officers and personnel who make decisions that lead to the loss of lives. And this is what we saw yesterday.
Just ahead of the break, let me just ask you this final question. We could discuss it after the break. But in the light of all these various commissions and inquiry and special this and special probes and all that business, none of this has ever worked out. Look what happened to the Bond Commission. Where's the final product? Where's the final result of that? Item 2, Mr. President, in your manifesto, that you will do something about it. Well, it's taken a pretty long time. And now you've sent the Minister of Justice to Finance, so God knows what's going to happen to that case. It needs to be fair, it needs to be resolved either way, because it's unfair for those who appear to have been charged and to their families if they're going to be dragged through this whole horrendous process. But do you think, what is the confidence level of the public when everyone's saying, look, we need an independent inquiry into this incident in Rambukana?
Absolutely, and that's a really good question, because if this independent inquiry is going to be another commission of inquiry, I think the public will not bite. Commissions in the past have been, nothing but eyewash. So I think that would be certainly not sufficient as an independent, impartial inquiry. Yeah.
Thank you. And on that note, let's go for a quick break, shall we? And we'll see you on the other side after listening to the primetime news headlines.
Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukut.
What really happened in Rambukana? Why did the police open fire at the protesters? Roads in Panadura reopened. Should Parliament break for lunch or not? MPs delve deep into the matter. Will the IMF grant assist Sri Lanka?
Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukut.
And welcome back to Newsline Live. I'm in conversation with the constitutional and sort of human rights expert, Dr. Gehan Gunatilleke. Thank you for being on the program. So, the public confidence in any sort of independent inquiry. What would you advise the government to do if you want the public to really believe this in the independence of whatever body they put to look into the Rambukana incident?
No, it absolutely needs to be driven by the judiciary. I don't believe that a presidential commission of inquiry will satisfy anyone. I think access to independent observers would be necessary in whatever process, and I'm very glad to hear that the Bar Association had in fact wanted to observe any kind of inquiry into this issue. I think there needs to be transparency in terms of what actually takes place within the inquiry, so the public can also be seen at least to observe this and have confidence that this is not going to be another sort of whitewash of past crimes. I mean, this is we know what has happened in the past, and we haven't seen accountability for terrible abusers. So I can imagine people not being confident that this would also produce justice, but justice is absolutely necessary, because there's a moment here that the entire country is outraged and live ammunition was used against protesters. Everyone is going to feel it, because unlike in the past where people have had the opportunity to be indifferent because they're not personally affected, this time is different because everyone you know is also a protester.
Indeed.
So this is one of us in many ways.
Yeah.
So I think that is going to be the difference this time.
Do you think, I mean, look, I've got a very suspicious mind, and what can I do? But, so my suspicion says that this whole business in Rambukana was some sort of ploy. It went wrong. It was a bit like La Santa, you know. It went wrong. They were meant to scare him is one story, but they ended up killing La Santa. Wickramatunga. Do I have to say the last name? Everyone knows that. Right? He died in 2009. He was unlawfully killed in 2009. You know. Do you think that this is some sort of ploy, or could it be a ploy, to support the case that they may be going to court tomorrow or day after to try and resolve this sort of impasse that is happening at Galle?
Well, this is why I made the point that it is a politically bizarre thing to do, to actually kill a protester, right? So I don't see it as a ploy, because I can't make sense of how this could actually help, unless you're saying that by escalating things you can actually justify a curfew and you can justify military intervention and that kind of thing. I'm not certain that that is the case, simply because for me it seemed like a localized situation that went out of control. We haven't seen the police misbehave in that way in other protests. We haven't certainly seen it here in Colombo. Now, you might be able to argue that no, that's because Colombo has a particular level of affluence, and that affluence is protection, and then these are, you know, people from a different background, and they are much more vulnerable in that context. And I think that that's a valid point to make. But I certainly hope you're not right. If you're right, I think we're in for a lot more outrage.
How possible, from a legal point of view, is to declare these gatherings, let's take Galle, but it's not only in Galle, it's all over the place. It's in Kandy, it's in Jaffna, it's in Galle, in Balapitiya, you know, in Rambukana as well, right? So how possible is it from a legal perspective to bring charges of an unlawful assembly?
Well, you will first have to get a court to declare it an unlawful assembly, and you'll have to demonstrate to that court that these people are committing acts of violence.
And they're acting contrary to the provisions of Article 14.
Well, they're exercising their rights under Article 14 right now. So I would start by saying that they're absolutely within the Constitution by, you know, staging protests, peaceful assemblies. So in order to declare something unlawful, an unlawful assembly, you have to demonstrate that these people are committing acts of violence and destroying public property, disrupting you know, public life in a way that is unconstitutional themselves, right? And I would imagine that if the government succeeds in getting an order of that nature, there will be dozens and dozens of petitions before the Supreme Court seeking a declaration that their fundamental rights under Article 14 have been violated. Their freedom of expression, freedom of speech, their freedom of peaceful assembly, their freedom of movement, all of it being violated as a result of an order of that nature. So I imagine that there will be some kind of contestation if such a order is obtained. But then again, how do you control an entire country from protesting? If you go back to what took place on, I believe it was the 3rd of April or 2nd of April, when curfew was declared. Many people violated curfew because they did not see the curfew as legally legitimate or legally justified. So people ignored it, and there was civil disobedience. And what happened? You couldn't sustain the curfew. It was lifted, and we haven't had a curfew since. We've had a police curfew in Rabukana, but apart from that, we haven't had it because people are not going to accept it. And if this is why I said politically it's bizarre. If the government wants to be even more unpopular, that's what it needs to do: declare curfew. And it'll become even more unpopular.
I've got a sort of flip side question sent in by one of our viewers. Thank you for that, by the way. If that browser was set on fire, it would explode, killing thousands. By shooting this hooligan who has a criminal record, according to police, therefore police has saved many lives. Now, I just want to say that I've just read something out. I haven't been able to verify how accurate this statement is. Let's get a response on the basis that this may have happened, this possibility.
I mean, I have no way of responding to some sort of...
It's a hypothetical question.
If there's a hypothetical situation...
There's a hypothetical situation is that this hypothetical man with a criminal record went and tried to set fire to the browser, and therefore the police shot him.
Well, I would say that the allegation that he has a criminal record is a post hoc allegation. There's no way the police can
knew at the time
can know that this person is a criminal and therefore shoot the person. This is a post event.
This is some sort of thing you can see on Netflix.
Exactly.
Knew all that.
This is a post event claim that this person has a criminal record, and then how does, I don't know how in a heated situation like that the police would be able to assess the fact that this person is going to explode a browser.
I know that in Britain, the police who are armed form part of a separate unit within the police, the armed response unit. And so before they can actually fire, a senior officer must authorize that.
Absolutely.
And if they shoot out of turn, then they'll be in trouble.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. There are scores of cases where the police claim that a person that they had taken into custody pulls out a grenade or pulls out some weapon or takes a weapon from another police officer and attempts to cause harm. And in that scuffle, the person in custody is shot. It's almost like a playbook. And you have these cases. And there's always a narrative that is given. And I imagine that a similar narrative will be given in this case. So the person who's asking this question is presenting a plausible narrative that makes the killing of someone sympathetic. And I have seen it before. And in a way, I'm not going to answer the question and legitimize that narrative. If there's an independent inquiry, and we're all satisfied that it is independent, and the inquiry concludes that this is in fact what happened, then let it be. And then let us say that this may have been justified.
But this is the whole problem with officialdom in this country. They think that the republic, the sovereign people of this country are a bunch of nincompoops, because they think that we don't understand this nonsense. When somebody's taken into custody, they do a full body check. They empty the pockets, they take the shoelaces out, they do the whole works. And then when they take that suspect to some point where they're going to identify something, lo and behold, the suspect has produced a grenade or a weapon or some sort of nonsense. This is completely disgraceful. And yes, indeed, Dr. Gehan Gunatilleke, Sri Lanka's system is littered with such cases.
Yep.
But finally, I know that the army have a book, a manual
Yes,
on how to
yes,
do things
yes,
in a humanitarian
yes,
way.
Yes.
Do you think the same is available to police officers?
Absolutely, and I think police officers are governed by a particular code of conduct, and I mean, I have been involved in providing human rights training through the University of Colombo. There are police officers that are outstanding. And in any institution you will have outstanding officers, which is why I'm saying that it is often a localized problem. And we need to fix those problems if we're going to ensure that this sort of thing doesn't happen in the future.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gehan Gunatilleke, our guest tonight on Newsline Live. It's now time for the primetime news. Sorry about the delay. Take care, have a great evening, and God bless you all.